Alrighty, so eventually, here's chapter 13. Okay, so when it comes to these frameworks of feminist thought, obviously there's a lot of diversity. There's different standpoints and approaches when it comes to feminism. So, hopefully this will help you with your short answer essay question. So, when it comes to liberal feminism, this is something that's largely grounded in the central principles of Western democratic society. So, just meaning that they focus on individual rights and freedom from discrimination. So, they argue that people need equal access to social and political institutions based on that concept of equal rights. So, they want to reform in the existing social institutions so that they include women or people of color, or anyone that's marginalized from that system. Socialist feminism is arguing that women's oppression is related to social class and to patriarchal gender relations, and we're going to get more in depth into that in a minute. Radical feminism is looking more specifically at patriarchal social relations as the primary cause of women's oppression. Multiracial feminism argues that we need to move past this kind of white feminist perspective and include the perspectives and insights of people of color. Postmodern feminism is focusing on the socially constructed basis of gender in society and how so much of what we understand about gender and sexuality is something that comes from a very specific socio-political cultural time period. Queer theory is this analysis of sexuality that sees sexuality as highly fluid and also socially constructed. And again, we'll go through all of these individually. So radical feminists are arguing that dominant institutions are organized through gender, race, and class oppression. So they criticize liberal feminists for their assumption that gender roles are largely an issue of history. That's less so an issue today. Radical feminists are saying, well, this is something that's built into the institutions themselves, so it gets reproduced generationally. And as far as social class connections, as the growth of capitalism and the rapid spread of industrialization took place, what came with it was changes to those other social institutions. We talked about this a lot in class, how the economy affected so many other institutions. So, changing the social and political status of women was affected to the kind of work that they did, whether it was in the home or outside of the home. So, by linking women's oppression with other forms of economic and political oppression, many early feminists, themselves had links to union movements. I mean, we talked about like suffragettes and their links to abolition movements. Um, and though some of them did not advocate for feminism directly, they clearly linked the oppression of women to other forms of economic and political oppression that were going on within society at the same time through that rise of capitalism. So, specifically, socialist feminism. So, they're looking at the importance of class and capitalism. So, how changes in the economy shaped other changes in society, such as new forms of poverty, labor, and other problems that we still face today. So women were working in more industrial industries, and feminism was really just emerging at that time period as a social and political force to kind of respond to the changes in work, lives, and oppression of women. So, there's a lot of, for socialist feminism, they're looking at a lot of kind of like Marx and Engels and conflict theory to kind of understand how social class is deeply tied to women's oppression. So they use Karl Marx and his ideas of historical materialism or dialectical materialism, which basically the main argument of that historical materialism is that the material condition of people's lives shape their behavior and their beliefs. So basically, our consciousness and behavior is formed between, how we basically live our lives within our world. So how we work, what we do, how our interactions are labeled and understood affects, who we are. So because people have the ability to reflect on their actions, their ideas and ideals are reflected in the material world. So people's relationships to their environment, what they think about it, are also mediated by the historical time period and ideology that it comes from. So when it comes to production and reproduction, socialist feminists, we're looking at how human production, is something that men and women do as the basis of social structure. So Marx saw, socialization as something that kind of came through this process of kind of working in these oppressive industries day in, day out, which shaped your expectations of your own life. And so he argued that social change was something that came from the actual organization of human labor. So human production and reproduction were what create the conditions for everyday life. So that could be a repressive reification of the status quo, or it could be something where it's like a class consciousness thing where people realize that they're being screwed. When it comes to class and capitalism, in Western capitalistic societies, the economic infrastructure is marked primarily by class struggle. So capitalists are those who own the means of production. You have the whole kind of proletariat bourgeoisie thing where you have the people that work for the owners themselves. And of course, the bourgeoisie itself can also include like small merchants or what we consider like the small business class today. And something that often kind of escapes the analysis is what he called the lumpen proletariat. So people often have this kind of weird narrative of Marx where they're like, oh, he loved poor people, he cared about the issues of the poor. And it's like, not necessarily. He cared about the working class. And that is like a big distinction there. He considered people that didn't work, that were, poor and unworking, to be what he called social scum. So, he kind of exempted these people out of society, not seeing their contributions as valid as the actual working class. So he didn't really advocate on behalf of them at all. So again, when they're talking about class, they're referring to the relationship of a group to, what means they can access in society. So when he talks about material objects and human beings, he's talking about how the products themselves take on a greater value than the workers, as, their work is kind of relegated to a wage labor system. And so, today we would call that the need for people over profits, but, at the time it was kind of this idea of material objects. So in the book, they talked about Mother Jones, who was, pretty rad. She was a strong advocate for workers' rights. I mean, she even changed her birthday to coincide with the Haymarket demonstration for the 8-hour workday. What we now call May Day, right? May 1st. She gave a lot of speeches and organized demonstrations. She was jailed for over 20 years for her kind of, actions. And ironically, though, she didn't support suffrage. She saw it as a distraction. She even famously said, like, I never had a vote and I raised hell all over this country, like basically saying you don't need a vote to change the system. So it's kind of ironic. She didn't necessarily stand up for the issues of suffrage, even though she was kind of like a very strong feminist figure in that time period. But yeah, she saw it as a distraction from her kind of movement for class equality. So let's see, ideology and consciousness. So the information we consider knowledge takes their historical form in response to the modes of production. So kind of going back to what we talked about before, when the economy was organized around production within the home, you saw the social roles reflect that. The roles of men and women in society reflected that. The roles within the home reflected that, right? And then once industrialization took over and you have the wage labor economy, you see the kind of idea of separate spheres come up. You see the idea that women stay at home, men work in a factory, all this kind of crap. So that's really what they're talking about when they talk about how, the information we consider knowledge takes its historical form in response to the modes of production at that time period. So, Marx talks about false consciousness and class consciousness. Basically, false consciousness being when the subordinate group accepts the worldview of the dominant group. Again, something like today we would call voting against your own interests, right? When people kind of don't question billionaires because they're like, well, I want to be one day, right? When you're like, you're never going to be a billionaire. Sorry. And class consciousness is more when people realize they're being screwed and reject the values of the dominant class, which is something he considered necessary for any sort of, large-scale social change to take place. People needed to understand they're being screwed and overthrow their oppressors. All right, so let's see here. Okay, so still talking about this kind of socialism issue. One of the books that first talked about this issue of women's oppression in relation to social class was The Origin of the Family, Property, and State, which gave early feminists this alternative analysis to existing perspectives. And they basically argued that the family was a microcosm of society's class relations, so meaning that the family represented, the kind of capitalist system of one person in charge, they control a lot of the power, everyone else defers to them in hierarchy. So, basically putting the male role as, the powerful leadership role within the house, the wife and children as his subjects or subservient laborers. So that's kind of what they meant by that being a microcosm of the larger class relations. The feminist critique of Marx is really that, when socialist feminism emerged in the 70s, they were arguing that Marx and Engels were not considering their own point that, the sexual division of labor is the first form of class antagonism, and that women's oppression could not be reduced to capitalism alone. So, basically, Marx and Engels are saying if you got rid of the system of capitalism, that women would just be liberated. And the socialist feminists are saying it's really not that simple. So, one of the first socialist feminists to expand Marx's work was Juliet Mitchell. And so Marx had assumed that women would be liberated if they were liberated by social class. So there's this relationship that does exist between the economy and the role of women within it and their own subordination. But she looked at how this relationship had changed between the family and the economy, making it a unit of consumption instead of a unit of production, which also relates to women's sexuality, as we've talked about through media and through these other kind of chapters we went through, as women's bodies are used to sell everything in a sexualized way. So she kind of like connected the class oppression aspect to these other social institutions that are also oppressing women in different ways. So when it comes to this idea of separate spheres, again, we talked about the idea that the public is the world of men. Women are considered to be, in the private sphere. That's supposed to be normative and natural, reflecting some sort of gender duality, which is crap. But yeah, we talked about that a million times, so I'll go past that. And as far as in the book, they talked about this case study of unions. So labor unions themselves have included women over time, but they tend to be male dominated, and their membership, over time has dwindled, where it used to be kind of dominated by white men. Now, as there's been attacks on unions over the last 45 years, there's been a dwindling in membership. So a lot of these unions are now trying to kind of open up their ranks to, include more people of color, more women, more marginalized people. So in the book, they gave this example of this group called Justice for Janitors, who represent a low-wage sector of workers, where most of the workers are women or people of color. And so they ended up changing some of their organizational practices to include women in positions of leadership. So like giving them alternative duties or ways to kind of like come together and, make decision making as a group, which they were arguing in the book can serve as a valuable tool or model for other organizations to adopt to, kind of counter the fact that while these organizations are trying to be more inclusive, they still concentrate power the same way that society does. Okay, radical feminism. Okay, so they talk a lot about how male domination is basically the basis of women's oppression, so meaning patriarchy, right? So radical feminists argue that patriarchy is this sexual system of power in which men possess superior power and economic privilege. And so, they talk about how it's its own social, historical, and political force, meaning that male power and privilege is the basis of a lot of different social relations in multiple social institutions. So first they talk about the sex and gender system, which is this set of arrangements by which society transforms biological sexuality into products of human activity. So basically, we transform these ways that our sexual needs are satisfied. So the oppression of women ends up, kind of being tied into the social systems that create male solidarity, not simply just the economic production like socialist feminists are arguing. So when it comes to sexuality in the state, men's control of women's sexuality is one of the central issues of the domination of women, at least for radical feminist theory. And they see sexuality as the primary sphere of men's power, and heterosexuality as the institution through which men's power is expressed or maintained or, reified. So they do still, look at capitalism as an issue, right? They're still looking at social class as an issue, but just not as the primary focus like socialist feminism is. So, the assumption in these radical feminist analyses is that gender relations are more fundamental than just class relations. So this has kind of opened up different questions for, the paradigm of feminist theory in general. So when comparing some of these couple theories, each one has their own unique contribution to trying to understand the situation of women in society. But in a way, the different perspectives suggest different kinds of social change. So they're all ideal types. They tend to overlap a bit, which kind of further complicates this is the fact that feminists themselves often draw from like their specific personal understandings or analyses from multiple feminist frameworks. So it's not as if you have like, oh, all the liberal feminists hang out over there and all the socialist feminists over there. It's like oftentimes it's more so that people kind of like borrow and lend from multiple perspectives. So, when it comes to the kind of specifics of change, I mean, obviously, liberal feminism argues that social change should be established through individual civil rights, so no person can be denied access based on their social location. And they also argue that sexism is from past traditions or learned identities. So they see how if we change gender socialization, that we can hopefully affect the next generation when it comes to their perceptions and understanding of gender. Just like we talked about in class, how like I'm one of the first generations of people that they experimented on those like words, right? Changing the language to say like, instead of mailman, like mail carrier, or instead of policeman or fireman, it's like firefighter, police officer, like kind of at least having a gender neutral term that kind of offers the ability for people to at least imagine themselves in that role when they clearly can't when the name itself is man, right? Like congressman. Anyway, they still haven't fixed that. But anyway, so liberal feminists are really an interest group, politic group, meaning that they're interested in increasing political representation of women and trying to kind of, shape the systems from within, but still just kind of adapt to the existing systems. But socialist and radical feminism see the cause of sexism in the working of political and economic institutions themselves. So they both suggest that revolutionary changes have to take place to transform both capitalism and patriarchy. So socialist feminism makes social class the center of their analysis, while radical feminism locates sexism in the independent existence of patriarchy and the social relations that patriarchy generates. So meaning radical feminists see the need to destroy patriarchy to liberate women, and also radical feminists are emphasizing the creative dimension of women's experiences. So instead of just marginalizing women or seeing men as dominant, that we should kind of include the voices and perspectives as women because they're also people and they might have something valuable to add. So again, there's many shared ideas and politics that overlap within these categories, so they're not completely separate and distinct. Let's see, when it comes to multiracial feminism, comparing those to other feminist perspectives, most of the earlier theories of women and women's oppression largely focused on white women, which really strongly distorts the experiences of other women who are excluded from these analyses. So multiracial feminism itself is not really a unitary framework, but it's more incorporating those multiple systems and really examining different systems of domination that shape the experiences of, Latinx people, African Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans, white women and men, everybody, right? And they do this through what they call the prism of difference, right? So just like how a prism shows the relationship between colors, so is the social structure of race, class, sexuality, gender, and all those other inequalities in a complex social structure, but they're all kind of interconnected. So that's what we've been talking about throughout the whole semester, this idea of intersectional theory. So really that's seeing gender as socially constructed through those interlocking systems of race, class, gender, all that fun stuff. So of course they assume, at both the macro and micro level that that race and gender are socially constructed. So at the macro structural level, they're looking at how our immediate social institutions, social identities, and social consciousness are affected by our understandings of gender and race and how they really affect the understandings of each other, right? And so they see, also how it affects us at the micro level in our kind of complex relationships in the way that we, experience difference between men and women. So really, how it kind of constructs our understandings and experiences. So, they argue that the perspective of multiracial feminism should grow from the experiences of women of color. So it's not limited to the perspectives of women of color, but it grows from their experiences because they're often obscured or they're often marginalized voices. So in an effort to understand how systems of power shape the experiences of different groups in different ways, we have to listen to marginalized people. So, part of this involves agency, or referring to the active and creative way that human beings give meaning to their experiences and act on their behalf. So we're not just like passively, accepting what happens to us in society. We also kind of filter it through our existing frameworks of understanding, and that's kind of the way that we can resist and change through agency. And so in the book, they were talking about these Latino feminist masculinities. So there's this dominant conception of Latino working class men that's very colored by stereotypes about machismo and beliefs that see them as dominating, anti-feminist, and oppressive to women. So research on these men shows evidence to the contrary, studying Latino working class men that identify as feminists, that were keenly aware of the stigmas associated with their ethnic identities. And so their understandings of manhood themselves ranged from seeing a man as deeply connected to his family, deeply connected to his community, as well as involving an ethical dimension of standing by one's word, honoring people, and respecting others. And so these male Latino feminists tended to reject these concepts of manhood that define them as sexually aggressive. So, the research kind of shows that we have to really avoid generalizing and stereotyping groups of people based on the kind of cultural values of the, hegemonic cultural values of that group, because there's still plenty of people within those identities that reject or challenge those existing ideas. Okay, so for postmodernism, this is a form of contemporary social theory that explains how all knowledge stems from a specific historical time period and the conditions in which it was produced. So hopefully I've been talking about that enough throughout the semester that this kind of makes sense. So when it comes to objectivity and truth, postmodernism as a theoretical framework sees society not as an objective thing, but as a fluid construction of alternative meaning systems. So they argue the only way we can know things is by deconstructing the social text and stories coming from various points of view and experiences. So postmodernism recognizes that socially constructed assumptions are built into the knowledge frames from any historical time period. So we talked about this before, like the quote-unquote scientific research of 100 plus years ago that said that if women read, their ovaries would explode. Or the valid scientific research that said that like certain racial categories were inherently inferior, right? A lot of those things today we look back on and go, oh my God, like clearly that wasn't science or true. But it just kind of shows how, whatever ideology is coming out of a time period, it's going to be affected by the political, social, and cultural understandings of that time. And that we have to really kind of deconstruct, like really critically look at those value systems in relation to what they're promoting. So when it comes to science and objectivity, they don't see science as separate from these deconstructions. They also see science as something coming from a specific historical time period ideology. So they're very wary of like the generalizations that come from those understandings. So some of the challenges posed by postmodernist thought. Postmodernism is built on a distrust of a lot of the ways of thinking that are basic to scientific approach to understanding life and society, some of those kind of like basics we learn in like a research methods. So in a way, it's difficult to kind of practically apply. So the part of it is this idea of essentialism. So meaning that they argue that things are socially constructed and that there's nothing essentially male or female. These are things that arise from specific social and cultural phenomena, not from anything biological. So not just in the gendered sense, but they also see the notion of biological differences between the sexes to be socially constructed as well, something I think I threw out at you guys like day one. We're talking about Anne Fausto Sterling and her idea about the 5 biological sexes, how like technically there's 5, but we only really culturally, socially accept 2. So if we were talking just straight science biology, then there's 5, right? But if we're talking about, what's culturally accepted, there's 2, and we kind of like force children to go through these unnecessary surgeries in order to fit them into that kind of social standard, not biological standard. So they use in the book this, what they call the metaphor of the coat rack, where basically they assume the body is a coat rack on which different cultural artifacts are hung. So basically they deny that we have any essential differences, saying instead we react to the labels or social categories that are placed upon us. So those cultural artifacts are just those socially created categories of difference. And feminist postmodernists are skeptical about categorizing people because they see all of these categories as influenced by our human subjectivities. So, by labeling or categorizing people in that way, you might be, generalizing something that doesn't really apply to them. So they also look at the social construction of language as they see language as not something that's just external to us that we use to explain, what it is we're seeing to others, but it's also a reflection of the culture and the cultural values. So they emphasize diversity, not unity. So meaning that they like to focus on the unique, not the general. They, really talk about it in a relativistic way. So of course, a lot of more mainstream sociological thought is looking at like a bell curve idea. What are the majority of people experiencing, right? But within postmodern thought, they're thinking of, what is the diversity in experience? What are the differences that you see, not the similarities? So this, because they see social meanings varying and changing, they don't want to have kind of a specific unified theory about these things. So some of the criticisms of postmodern theory is just that it's obtuse or difficult to understand, which makes it inaccessible to someone without an advanced degree. So it does need to be something that can appeal to larger audiences to be more of an effective paradigm. Okay, there it goes. Okay, so when it comes to queer theory and sexualities, obviously there's a connection off the top to postmodern thought because, postmodern thought it's very connected to the same kind of basis of assumptions for queer theory. So, they overlap in their approach and really just, again, the assumption that social categories are socially constructed. So queer theory itself is a newer perspective that emerges from studies of sexuality from a postmodern lens. So it understands sex and the body as purely social concepts that come from the discourse in society, specifically religion, health and medicine or psychology. So just how the kind of beliefs and values and categories that were created through that, shape our social understandings about people and sexuality. So, they talk about how, like, the creation of the categories of homosexual and heterosexual, which came about at the turn of the last century, and only came from a very Western sexual idea of thought, right? Something fascinating that if you take my sexualities course, we'll talk about. I'll make you read Foucault. But in regards to how we understand these categories, it has everything to do with their definitions. So, the categories of homosexual and heterosexual themselves have been constructed through certain scientific discourses who created these dichotomous categories, saying one was normative and natural, and one was an aberration. And really, the discourse that comes from these institutions like science and medicine and society have a weight to them. So they have like an assumed legitimacy because people are like, well, a doctor said it, or it came from science, so therefore it must be true, it must be valid. And so these understandings and categories that we create really either affirm or manipulate or shape people's identities. So obviously queer theory attempts to deconstruct categories and understandings of sexuality to understand the underlying power dynamics and ideologies that are constructing and driving the social constructions of sexuality. So queer theory criticizes traditional empirical studies of sexuality because they see them as being unreflective of the categories on which such research is based. So, if you're taking it from a very kind of modern, like non-postmodern, I guess, like not really critical perspective, and you're essentializing these categories as normative and natural dichotomies, mutually exclusive dichotomies, then you're not really understanding the kind of like fluid, more underlying power dynamics of how these things are constructed and how they change as the culture changes. So, queer theory is something that's very tied to practical application when it comes to trying to call attention to injustices faced by the LGBTQ community. So this has involved some movements for civil rights, which can be seen through the struggles for marriage equality that took place a few years back. And their goals were to transgress and challenge sexual categories and subvert the political status quo. So one example of this they gave in the book was what they call kiss-ins. So, they're a transgressive activity where same-sex couples will protest against homophobia. So a recent example would be when Chick-fil-A was in the news a couple years back. And the CEO basically had this stance against marriage equality, and he financially backed the like Yes on Prop 8 campaign. So people went to the restaurant and protested, often kissing as a form of protest. So they, kind of showing visibility, spreading messages like love is love, or in more recent times in protest against Trump and Pence, as far as their stance on LGBTQ issues. People will, kiss in front of, these like, different protests and have signs that say things like love trumps hate or whatever. Basically, using this kind of visual marker of kissing in order to protest discriminatory policies that affect them.